Okay, I would say let's start. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Marcus Thiel. I'm a European politics professor at Florida International University and direct the European Union Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And as such, it is my pleasure to welcome you all for the next hour or so, where we will actually get a really good update on what is happening in Ukraine and perspectives going forward by two fantastic Ukrainian scholars. So I'm excited that they're here, even though the topic, of course, is, rather depressing. I'm sure you agree. So as part of FIU's Ukraine Response Task Force effort to raise awareness and also to raise funding about the war in Ukraine, we at the Jean Monnet Center, together with our friends at FIU, have organized this virtual panel with two wonderful Ukrainian experts who will provide their expertise. But before I introduce them and let them speak, and then afterwards, you can ask questions either through the chat box or if you want to unmute yourself. Then before I introduce them, I just want to thank quickly a number of people that we have to thank. And first and foremost, that is, of course, the European Commission, the European Union, who funds our Jean Monnet Center activities. Then also I want to thank our FIU, Ukraine Response Task Force, led by Dr. Hilary Landorf and Dr. Alejandra Para, as well as our Ukrainian students, faculty, staff, and scholars, including particular Malgorzata and Andrei Durigan, who is Malgorzata. I can see you that you're here, so thanks for being here. And last but not least, I want to thank our two great scholars, Dr. Natalia Kazianenko, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, and Dr. Roman Kalichak. Now, before we begin, I will just very quickly introduce each speaker right before they have about 10 to 12 minutes to present, their update, their expertise. And like I said, then it's time to get into a discussion. And we're a rather smaller circle, so I think we can keep this rather informal. Now, but let me introduce you to Dr. Natalia Kazianenko. Dr. Kazianenko is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Fresno. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Nevada, Reno, and her research on comparative politics and international relations focuses on nationalism, identity politics, and human rights in the countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Her research really focuses on the top-down and bottom-up elements of nationalism, and she explores how political elites intensify nationalism to gain legitimacy for their politics. A native of Ukraine, she graduated from Kharkiv National University with a degree in economics, and she received her master's in international relations from California State University. Dr. Natalia Kazianenko, the floor is all yours. Thank you for being here. And fantastic. Also, I hope that you and your family are, of course, safe, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Thiel, for this introduction. And thank you for having us and for your interest in Ukraine and for your support of Ukraine. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the background to this war in Ukraine and discuss my area of research with a specific focus on the occupied Donbass, since my several recent research projects focus specifically on the occupied Donbass since 2014 onwards. And I also do some research with regard to identity politics and specifically look at how media is used as a tool of essentially gaining legitimacy by the government, and how media might be manipulated in order to sway public opinion and shift public opinion. So I think both of these themes are really relevant when it comes to the current war in Ukraine. So essentially, I wanted to sort of make several points. With regard to the Donbass, Russia has started the war in Ukraine in February of this year, with the core justification being that liberation of the Donbass. And now we're, I think, at in day 104 of the Russian war. And of course, we all realize that it is not about the Donbass, and it has never been just about the Donbass. But still to this day, the Russian media, the Kremlin is using these references of the Donbass, the conflict that's been happening in the Donbass since 2014, the suffering, children dying in the Donbass. All of this is used sort of as a justification for really waging this, what they call, what the Russians are calling special military operation in Ukraine. So overall, we know that Donbass is strategically important to Russia. Currently, the main focus of the war is actually in this area in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and also in the south, particular areas that Russia has occupied in the last 3 months. So just several points about this region of the Donbass. First of all, sort of how did the war in the Donbass start? Because really we can say that the war that Russia has started in Ukraine began not on February 24th of this year, but it began 8 years ago in the Donbass. So as you may know, in early 2014, Ukraine had its Euromaidan revolution, and essentially protesters forced the resignation and the flight of Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych. He was from the Donbass. He was the former political boss there and pro-Russian politician. So the Kremlin sort of saw these Euromaidan protests, what participants in Ukraine called the Revolution of Dignity, as a Western plot against Russia's influence in Ukraine. And as the rise, the Russian side portrayed the Euromaidan as the rise of nationalism in Ukraine. It viewed the revolution as illegal, as illegitimate, and the new regime that has emerged after Yanukovych fled, Russia essentially viewed that regime as a military junta of sorts, and that narrative was continuously reiterated in state-controlled media in Russia. So essentially, after the revolution has ended, Russia has moved very quickly during this vacuum of power period in Ukraine in order to annex Crimea and to basically instigate protests in the Donbass, in eastern regions of Ukraine. There's two areas there, two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, and basically Russia supported militarily, politically, economically the separatists who now proclaimed independence from Ukraine and proclaimed that there's going to be essentially two People's Republics, People's Republic of Donetsk and People's Republic of Lugansk. So since 2014, we're seeing this conflict that's happening in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, between the separatists that are backed by Russia and the Ukrainian military. And there have been multiple efforts, multilateral efforts to bring peace to this region. And there has been some sort of stabilization, if we can call it that way, since conflict still waged on and people were dying, soldiers continued to die. Yet for a while, it seems like there was some sort of frozen conflict in place. I think it's also important here in this regard to talk about the public opinion in the Donbass. What do people in the Donbass actually want? Since we're talking about separatism, we're talking about Russia now claiming to liberate these areas. So part of my research deals with this public opinion. And as you may imagine, researching public opinion in the Donbass is quite difficult, considering that, first of all, so many people have left the region after 2014, after the conflict has started. There was originally, I think, like 6.5 million people living there. And since the start of the war, half of them left. And of course, since February of this year, even more people fled. And then engaging in public opinion research through surveys is kind of problematic because people are fearful, right? People mistrust the authorities, whether these are local authorities or not. People are afraid to speak what their mind, and they're afraid to basically express their opinions. And a lot of people are actually confused about what's going on, or at least that seems to be the case. So the latest survey that we have from the Donbass was from January 2022, so January of this year. And the survey was conducted by O'Loughlin, Toll, and Sasse, and essentially 3 agencies were involved in collecting survey data from the Donbass. And both Russia, or I would say separatist occupied areas, separatist controlled areas of the Donbass, and Ukraine controlled areas of the Donbass were surveyed. So to kind of summarize some things, the majority of people in both the occupied areas and Ukraine controlled areas actually expressed the preference to remain in Ukraine rather than being annexed to Russia. And only about 9 to 10% of respondents on both sides, Ukraine-controlled and separatist-controlled, preferred independence of these self-proclaimed republics, right? So we're talking about specifically this notion that Russia is now claiming that it recognizes the 2 republics, something that Russia hasn't done in the last 8 years until February of this year. And Russia claims to basically defend the independence of the republics, yet the people on the ground do not really want that option. They are thinking about either being remaining in Ukraine or being part of Ukraine, potentially with some autonomy in place for this particular region, or they want to join Russia, similarly to how Crimea was annexed by Russia. So I think that's sort of quite interesting. And another interesting point that survey research time and time again showed from the Donbass was that the majority of the population actually sort of preferred, I would say, the notion of having public goods, having security, stability, rather than having some form of allegiance to one state or another. So the question that was presented in surveys was the following. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It does not matter what country I live in. All I want is a good job and a good pension. So the majority of people, over 50% on both sides of the line of contact, Ukraine-controlled and separatist-controlled, basically agreed with the statement. So economic and material security, and I'm speaking about the period and surveys being taken before February of this year, right? Before the war has really took on this massive scale. So economic and material security trumps separatism and nationalism, trumps allegiance to the state. And I think for the American audience, it's very kind of difficult and surprising. It's very difficult to accept this notion, and it's confusing, right? Why would you not have a preference for one state or another? But I think there's a range of explanations that could be given here. The mixed identities, the tools of Russian propaganda in the region, and merely the fact that people want to have to go on with their lives after years and years of conflict. They want stability, they want security, and they want safety for their families. So this preference for public goods, it's kind of going to be a challenge for Russia, a challenge to deliver, considering mounting economic difficulties that Russia is facing now and is going to face in the future. So thinking about the areas that Russia has already occupied in eastern Ukraine, in southern Ukraine in the last 3 months, it's going to be difficult to make that pitch to the residents of the Donbass or to the residents of Kherson, for example, that your quality of life will improve once you join Russia, like Crimea did. If the ideological component is not there, if people do not really feel that allegiance to the Russian state, if there's no legitimacy, then taking the territory by force is not enough. You'll have trouble holding on to that territory. And then just for a little bit, I wanted to also make several points with regard to how media is used, state-controlled media is used by Russia to achieve its goals in Ukraine. I think kind of in the grand scheme of things, what we're noticing is that the narrative of the Russian government has been consistent since 2014. The Russian media used and promoted these ideas that Ukraine is a Nazi state. It's nothing new. Ukraine is ruled by an illegitimate regime. Ukraine is not a real state. It's a puppet regime controlled by the West. But it also seems like in the last several years, the core narrative of the Kremlin has shifted away from this idea that Ukraine needs to be within Russia's sphere of influence to now being replaced by this idea that Ukraine's territory needs to be captured, reinforcing this notion that Ukraine itself should not exist. And maybe this shift is in response to the first idea failing. Russia has essentially lost Ukraine after 2014. Ukraine has firmly aligned with Europe, with the West, and started to disassociate and distance itself from Russia. So we're now kind of seeing a newer, more radical approach to using territorial imperialism by Russia, something that we didn't think was even possible in Europe in the 21st century. And of course, that shift is accompanied by the ongoing narrative that Russia needs to engage in this war to fight against the belligerent West, that it's a war against Western imperialism, it's the war against the US hegemony, NATO expansion, that the US is funding the Nazi regime in Ukraine, that World War III is imminent. Now we're in the last, I would say, months or so, the Russian media is really even ramping up this radical rhetoric by talking about the use of nuclear weapons to fight for the survival of Russia, to fight against the West, and really the talk, this narrative is getting out of control because there's no counterweight to it. In the last 3 months, all independent media sources in Russia were completely shut down. So all media stand control, no resistance to this pro-Kremlin narrative at all. And it seems like Putin himself is changing his narrative as well. He no longer stresses the unity of Russian and Ukrainian people now that his initial goal and his initial mission to take Ukraine in a span of a few days has failed. He's no longer talking about Russia and Ukraine being, Russians and Ukrainians being the same people. Yeah, so I think I'm going to stop here and we can talk about more specific questions through the Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for giving us this good update and also some of the intricacies, right, of the Eastern regions, which, you know, for American and European audiences may just not be quite as familiar even after 100+ days of war. But now let's switch the focus a little bit and let's talk about another really important issue in the Ukraine invasion, and that is sort of Ukraine's relations with the European Union. And so here we have a fantastic expert here, Dr. Roman Kalichak. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Kalichak is Associate Professor for International Relations and Diplomacy at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. He's also currently a Fulbright Scholar at George Washington University. So he's stateside. And that is something we were talking about earlier before we started. He's also a senior research fellow of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, I suppose, at Ivan Franko National University, and involved in 7 different Jean Monnet projects. So that's quite a bit. We can hardly manage here too. At the same time, he's also a member of the Ukrainian Association of Professors and Researchers on European Integration and a member of the Scientific and Curriculum Council of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine. His research mainly include European Union studies, EU-Ukraine relations, international dimension of regions and cities, higher education of Ukraine, and he has widely published on all these topics. Here to tell us a little bit about more what the future holds for Ukraine's hopefully home in the European Union. Dr. Kalichak, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I will just open my presentation.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. I will try to squeeze 3 decades in 10 minutes, yes, but I usually start my presentation with this short video. It's like 3 decades of Ukraine-EU relations, yes. Just to realize how it is seen from Ukraine, this 3 decades, just, yes. Just in case this Georgia is coming, yeah? Georgia is coming. Okay, just final moment. Again, it's about 3 decades. Natalia was right when she mentioned about the EU. And I would like to point out this time we're talking about NATO, about this time about aggression, about in 2014, we talk about the EU. In fact, it was because of Ukraine was about to sign association agreement. This was one of the key triggers of the so-called revolution of dignity. Yes, but what it was again about the United States. Yes, okay. Russian media blame mainly not the EU but United States for organizing Euromaidan. Now it's just to understand, again, I think it would be useful for the American audience. It's something that you cannot find a lot in American media, what is going about EU-Ukraine relations, but EU-Ukraine relations are vital or one of core element of nation-state building for Ukraine. Yes. Just recently, I would like to remind you that the war started on February 24th. Already on February 26th, President Zelensky makes appeal to join the European Union. And on February 28th, Ukraine formally applied for EU membership. Just to realize that Kyiv is fighting close to Kyiv. Kyiv is about, at least based on some media, was encircled by the Russian troops, and Ukraine president has submitted the official application for EU membership. Yes, and on April 18, Ukraine formally submitted a complete questionnaire. If you don't know all specificities of EU, I would like to join all courses that offered by Jean Monnet Center. They would provide you with more information what's going on. But just to understand, there is a consensus within Ukraine about joining the European Union. Yes, I will show you next slide. Yes, now it's about 90%. You can see that in different stages, the support was different, but usually around 50. Another thing, there is a political consensus. Before the war, I was involved in another project. It was about Euroscepticism among political elites. I would like to say I interviewed many politicians, not only from the opposition bloc, and mainly the majority of them were, if not pro-EU, they were quite adopted a neutral approach. Yeah, you cannot find strong anti-EU political forces in Ukraine. So in terms of population and talking about the support of Ukrainian nation and political support, so there is a consensus within Ukraine. Another important thing is how EU reacted. And European Parliament was always favorable, yes, for closer ties with Ukraine, and even in previous resolutions supported the idea of Ukraine to join the European Union. In March 1st, yes, on March 1st, it adopted a resolution where all for granting EU candidate status to Ukraine. And there are different stages. You agreed to assess a bid submitted by Ukraine to join the European Union. And we expected two major decisions: a decision from European Commission, opinion from European Commission, yes, on if Ukraine is not ready or to become a candidate country. But most important, the decision of European Council on June 23, 24. Here we have problems. When Marcus contacted me, I, like the majority, were convinced that, well, the status would be granted to Ukraine if Ukraine will become official. This is important to point out, official candidate country. But this is not the case anymore. We should expect. I just show you something. Okay, we don't know the final decision because European Council is composed of nation states. Yes, and the unanimity is required in this case. Here, one of the important things that the majority of EU citizens support the idea of Ukraine to join the European Union. This opinion poll was conducted by Eurobarometer, so it's official. It's very renowned. Yes, EU agencies that conducted regular similar opinion polls. It's not something that was conducted by some agency, but this is well-renowned and reliable source of information. So you can see like 66% of EU citizens support the very idea. It's very sizable number of EU citizens. You can see that in different countries you have different level of support. The most surprising for me, by the way, was the support in Bulgaria. I didn't get why there is so low level support of Bulgaria, but just in case. Just briefly, this is not the first time that Ukraine is seeking EU membership. So Ukraine never formally submitted any kind of official application, but at least there were 3 attempts before when Ukraine wanted or seriously considered. So it's 1999, it was the famous European Council when, yes, about the first, not the first enlargement, but the biggest enlargement in the case of EU, when Ukraine or President Putin considers the idea to submit this application, but he didn't. And there were 2 other, it's after the Orange Revolution, where President Yushchenko considered this idea. Again, he wanted to travel to Brussels, officially submit it, but again, he was convinced not to do. And the same thing happened after Euromaidan in 2014. So it's not the first time that Ukraine considered the idea to submit official application, but only now they submitted this. Just to a little bit understand about, again, we're talking about 3 decades. I will not, all information is on slide, just to focus. This is for Ukraine, being European is part of nation state building process. Yes, just to understand why is this so important. This is one of core element of Ukrainian identity, being European. Yes. And Ukraine declared its first attempts as the first aspiration to become the member in IT. So again, I would like to point out this is 3 decades of our relation. Why European Union to some extent? In fact, when you're talking about 90s, the EU was seen only like a Western European organization. Yes, only even in 92, when relations between the EU and Ukraine started, there were 12 countries basically. Yes, so European choice in the case of Ukraine was everything that might facilitate the return of Ukraine to Europe. The EU is seen like institutional manifestation of Europe. Yes, this is organization which incorporated the majority of European countries. Yes, and just to understand, there are not so much choices for Ukraine, and 3 choices: was to join some kind of post-Soviet bloc, remain neutral, and or remain neutral, so it be buffer state and gray zone. Yes. Or joins the European Union. It definitely is a majority of political elites in Ukraine opted for this choice. And our relations, in fact, from Ukraine perspective, not were so friendly. In fact, especially after the first Eastern enlargement in 2004, when Ukraine gets the first border with EU directly. For many in Ukraine, it was seen that Iron curtain was replaced with paper curtain. Just for me, being when you live in Lviv, yes, and it's like 60 miles from border. And when just in one day, we realized that we needed to visa to get in Europe. So Central Europe was a free visa zone for Ukrainians. Just in one moment, we realized that we are cut from other part of Europe. So in other case, we realized that we not negotiate, for example, economic trade ties with Warsaw or Prague. We should negotiate with Brussels. So it changed in the very idea what is Europe was European Union is in the case of Ukraine. So many, in the case of Ukraine, sees this like a new division in Europe and reinforcement of gray zone or exclusion of Ukraine from Europe. There were many initiatives, yes, by the European Union, like European Neighborhood or Eastern Partnership. It was this different kind of non-membership alternative in the case of Ukraine. Ukraine never liked the idea in any way of multilateralism or multilateral framework to deal with European Union, and especially now in the case, even so-called trio, Ukraine will not like the idea to be part of when now our application will be considered together with Moldova and Georgia. Again, just to explain, Ukraine also always favored by the bilateral relation, but still Ukraine accepted these different initiatives and never likes them. But okay, it's okay. We have not so much time. As I mentioned, after the Orange Revolution, there were very strong pro-EU aspiration within Ukraine, but again, no chance and to get any kind of membership perspective. But what was important, we started negotiating so-called association agreement. This association agreement played a crucial role in our history. In fact, this is just a trade agreement. This is agreement about free trade area. Just to understand, it was before it was like NAFTA, yes, here with North American free trade area, something like this. Maybe more enhanced version of this, but still we are talking here about association agreements. This association agreement played a crucial role in our history. Again, it was not seen from the Brussels as some kind of membership offer. It was seen like alternative to full membership. Yeah, and but it caused a EU drafted. It was quite complex, ambitious agreement, I would say. But this is the first time that Russia objected similar initiative. Yeah, they saw the EU for the first time as independent, more connected with the very idea of Eastern Partnership. They never liked it, this initiative within EU, especially after the EU, especially after Eastern Partnership. By the way, the EU offer to Russia to join a European neighborhood policy. Russia rejected this idea. It always opted for bilateral relation. But in fact, from this period, because in 90s, when we're talking about the EU relations, it was EU-Ukraine relations. EU adopted so-called Russia First policy, Russia First approach. So first they favored relations with Russia, only later they pay attention to Ukraine as a country. Since 2004, it's changed because exactly of European neighborhood policy. It was unexpected spillover effect of European neighborhood policy. As many of you know, so the very idea close the ties with EU. Russia objected, and Yanukovych was convinced by Putin, yes, not to sign the agreement between Ukraine and the EU. Again, I'm talking about just free trade agreement, just to understand. This triggered our Euromaidan, but more correctly, the revolution of dignity. It was not about, in fact, about the EU so much, but it was triggered by the very idea that you can just change your opinion one day. So it again that it shows to the world that Ukraine is not some kind of autocracy, and popular opinion does matter. So Ukraine protested, and as a result, it's illegal annexation of Crimea. Not I explain in detail the situation about Donbass in Ukraine. Yes. So focusing on Ukraine, so this is most dramatic EU treatment in the history with this country, and this is first time that similar, again, free trade agreement trigger armed aggression. So when talking about today NATO and Russian aggression, so we can see a similar pattern in this case. Yes. So EU until the February resisted in any agreement every ideas about membership question. So EU rejected just in any documents the very ideas that Ukraine could become a member country. Just would like to remind our American friends that Ukraine is in Rome Treaties with this article when any European state can apply for EU membership. This was illegal justification for Ukraine to consider this very idea. That's why even in many treaties or even official documents, it was called European aspiration, Eastern European country to avoid is the phrase European state. There were many treaties or many initiatives, not many treaties, but this partnership cooperation agreement, cooperation agreements, the European neighborhood policies, Eastern Partnership, Association Agreement, all of them represented for Ukraine only temporarily solutions. So the EU full-fledged membership will remain a priority for Ukrainian domestic foreign policy. Plus, this is part of our constitution. This is part of our constitution that Ukraine should become EU and NATO member, by the way. And now a little bit more about current situation, a discussion about the application. I would like to remind our American colleagues that EU is seen like a peace project within Europe. Yes, we don't recall the beginnings, but it was one of the key tools to preserve stability and peace in European continent. Because yes, because France, Germany, other countries joined the European Union, this prevented major conflicts. So this is a peace project in the case of Europe. It's not only trade area, but its case is a peace project. From Ukrainian perspective, again, I would like to point this out. So there is a consensus within Ukraine about joining the European Union. So again, there is this, as I showed you, there is a political, there is this popular support for Ukraine to join the EU by the EU citizen. What is the problem is about major players within EU like Germany, France, to less extent Netherlands, Spain, Austria, yes, that rather reject this very idea of Ukraine to be granted status of official candidate country. So there are like several options. Macron offers the idea of European political communities. It was together with UK, it was rejected by the UK, by Ukraine. Yes, it's like so there is another option, so-called potential members, potential candidate country. The status now have only two countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. It just, again, it is seen from Ukraine perspective like an excuse or justification to avoid, to not grant Ukraine a status of full, of official candidate. Yeah. So rejection, it's, again, it's like Kosovo. I would like to maybe in September to discuss the results of the European Council, because nobody knows for sure what would be decided. But again, if EU decides to reject the Ukrainian application and grant only status some kind of potential members, it will undermine the EU as, from my perspective, as normative power about when talking about the EU values. So it will discredit the very idea of European integration. It will be a political decision, by the way. Ukraine is, by the way, ready. She complies with Copenhagen, so-called Copenhagen criteria, and thanks to the association agreement, we implemented a lot so-called acquis communautaire, a lot of EU legislation that is necessary, is required to join. So Ukraine, if you compare with other countries, with other potential, with other candidate country before, is very well prepared to join, to be recognized as a candidate country. But it's, again, it's up to the EU to decide to take a final decision. But again, it will undermine the future, the bilateral relation. And okay, we'll be ready to ask the questions. Thank you. Sorry, it was a little bit hectic, but I like to again.
No, thank you. Thank you. No, I think you provided a lot of good information, and I think there's lots of food for thought and also discussion. I do have many questions that I took already down, but I also, of course, want to invite our audience here. And I think you saw my message earlier through the chat box to either, type your question or comment you may have, or you can simply unmute yourself. And then if you could please identify yourself quickly and ask a question to either of our two experts here. So is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Don't be shy. We're a small, sort of intimate group. What stays on Zoom, what happens on Zoom, hopefully stays on Zoom. Anyone?
If I may, I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Sure.
Do you want to wait and then let's get to Maxim? Maxim, if you could please unmute, and then Svetozar.
Yes, hello. My name is Maxim. I'm from Kiev. So the question that I want to ask you is regarding some, I will say directly, shameful leaders of Western Europe, such as French President Macron and Olaf Scholz. So like, what is their point behind trying to protect Putin and openly saying that we have to save Putin's face, or that we need to look forward to build the relations with Russia when it's like an active phase of war? It's a genocide. Like, what's the point of these European leaders when they do these statements publicly?
Thank you, Maxim. I let our experts go first, and then, I have my own thoughts, but let's go, please. If any one of you, Natalia, Roman.
Yes, quickly, Natalia mentioned about that many residents in Donbass justify their priority was public goods, welfare, good life. I would like not to speculate on this, but this is about in the case is the main priorities in the case of Germany, France is domestic politics, economic stability. In this case, it's definitely from Ukrainian position, it's quite selfishness. It's quite selfish, but still, I think this is the main driver behind the initiatives now. Yes, I can, obviously as a Ukrainian, I cannot agree and not approve similar approach because it's about solidarity and about the history. I would like to remind to both leaders the history and the period after Second World War and about solidarity of other countries that supported both France and Germany to be rebuilt, to be integrated, yes, in the Western world. So just quickly.
If I may say, I think there could be kind of several potential explanations here, and I agree with Roman that that notion of states defending their national interests, looking out for themselves, their socioeconomic interests. Politicians want to be reelected. That is featured strongly. I think states that have been quite dependent on Russia for energy, we've seen that the rhetoric has been specific, where Russia initially wasn't even directly blamed for the war, and there are ways to kind of engage in almost like appeasement of Putin. But there's also, I think, this notion that I think there's this almost image of Putin as a strongman who only understands the language of strength based on his background as the former KGB, and this notion that Putin has been cultivating the importance of Russia's greatness as a state, resurrecting this greatness, recreating Russian empire. So it almost seems like some states are proposing that the solution to this war would be to give Putin some way out, right? And you did mention it in your question, to allow Putin to save his face, right? To engage in some sort of negotiations and find some middle ground in order to stop the carnage, in order to stop the genocide that's happening, acts of genocide. And I think that's very misleading, this notion that Putin needs this way out, right? Even if his army and his military is not making grounds in Ukraine, or at least is not making grounds as fast as he expected it. I think Putin, using his tools of media, his tools of propaganda, can spin any narrative, can flip any situation, can flip any reality into his favor, and basically portray what's been happening in Ukraine as a win for Russia. Any scenario, even if the Russian military has to completely withdraw from Ukraine because it is losing, that can be spun as a victory for Russia, or the end of the special military operation, or the success of this operation and the evolution of the operation into a new stage. So yeah, I agree that this is not a good solution, but I think quite a few politicians, European politicians, are also thinking about, well, what's next, right? Once the war is over in Ukraine, we still have Russia there, right? An aggressive Russia, an aggressive Russian president. So we need to find some way to basically coexist with Putin, because he's there to stay, it seems like. We can't expect the Russian people to revolt and mobilize and overthrow Putin. So I think there's kind of a few explanations here.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, as a German American myself, right, I kind of understand at least some of the, or I try to understand some of the public opinion there. And, as a scholar of EU politics and institutions, I mean, I could certainly attest that, in my view, at least, in my informed view, that there has been what I would call like a liberal naivety, right? About, you know, the expectations post-Cold War about, you know, Russia will reform, Russia will become, right, a democratized country in our own image type of thing. And this is, you've seen this a lot, right? And in the initial 2000s, there may have been some more realistic prospects, but I think then Western Europe became, you know, too attached, right, to Russian oil and gas. And of course, that explains a lot what is going on right now, that kind of hesitancy in confronting Russia in addition. So there are many explanations for that. Yeah, thank you. Good question. Before we go to Sviatoslav, can we just take a question from the chat to mix it up a little bit? So Jean Rosenberg asked, what are the remaining conditions? I guess that's for you, Dr. Kalichak. What are the remaining conditions that Ukraine needs to meet to be admitted to the EU?
Okay, at this stage, we are talking about only to get the status of candidate country. Yes, we're not talking about to become a full member. So what from in Ukraine, as I mentioned, 3 decades, Ukraine was not recognized as a candidate country. So at this stage, it's usually I try to explain for international students, like, it's not about that you will be admitted to Harvard. It's about that you allowed to be admitted to Harvard. So at this stage, we are discussing that Ukraine is allowed to be admitted to the EU. In fact, there is a long way to get to the EU. We should adopt acquis communautaire, and there are a lot of reforms to be implemented. There is no doubt about it. It will take some time. Ukraine, as I mentioned before, is already quite well prepared because of association agreement, but to become full-fledged member, there is a long way to go. So at this stage, we only asking about to be allowed to pretend to become a full member. So again, we are not asking to be admitted. There is no fast track to join the EU at this stage. If I was correct, again, just to explain it, is Harvard. You're just allowed to be admitted, not to be admitted. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Marcus, could I just ask a question?
Sorry, can you just hold off? We had Sviatoslav who had his hand up for a while, if you don't mind, and then we can get back to you. Thank you. Yes, please, Sviatoslav.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit in hurry because it's air alarm in Ukraine right now, but I will be quick. So yeah, first of all, I would like to thanks to the organizers, to the speakers. You did fantastic raps. Thanks a lot. It was interesting to hear it. So my question is, you know, in Ukraine, there is a joke that when Ukraine joins the EY will no longer exist. And in your personal opinion, I know it's hard, but how long it will take to get the long-awaited EY membership for Ukraine, taking into account the recent events such as beginning of the war, the rumors about the accelerated EY accession procedure, and so on, and other stuff that Ukraine already proved that European integration is our top priority foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay, it's again about me. Okay, it will take some time, definitely, because it's very time-consuming based on experience, or even our Eastern European neighbors. So we should adjust our legislative system. It takes in the very idea Parliament should work like stamping this legislation. So it's time-consuming, but at this stage, we're talking about that EU enlargement, I would like to point out, was the most successful tool for transformation in Eastern Europe. We can now discuss about Hungary, about what's going in Poland, but still, EU enlargement, the very idea, the main incentive for this country to join the EU, was the key driver for their success. I cannot say this about Poland. This is definitely about Hungary, Czech Republic, even discussing now about Bulgaria, Romania. Both these countries change a lot, yes, thanks to joining the EU, etc. So it's up to us again. It's up to us, but you can become Harvard students only, or student of Florida International University only when you're allowed to become. At this stage, we are not allowed to become EU member Yes, what is the main difference? Simply, this is a very, from Ukrainian perspective, a very discriminatory approach to Ukraine. We just excluded from the very idea that we can become EU member. So at this stage, we ask for just one thing: officially to be granted status of candidate country. Yes, thank you. And we will not destroy EU. Well, again, there are many discussions, endless discussion about capacity of EU to welcome other members. In fact, it's true, and this would be mutual process of reconstruction or adjustment in any case. But Ukraine will not destroy EU from inside. And by the way, when many discuss about about labor force, about migration, labor migration, in the case of the EU, you can see that many Ukrainian refugees are returning, even they have now possibilities to stay in any EU country. So this is not a threat again if you're talking about some kind of migration.
Thank you. And there's, I mean, also, right, the Balkan countries who have also been in the EU enlargement waiting scheme for a couple of years. I heard that they are now getting also dissatisfied with sort of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova's fast track through application. So there's also, right, these kind of, you know, inner European competition for, you know, who gets most attention, who gets fast tracked in terms of accession, and so on and so on. Yeah, interesting. We had Professor Philip Church, I think. Philip, if you're online, and then Slavin. Thanks, appreciate it, and Svetoslav.
Yeah, well, I think some of my question was just answered possibly, but I understand the you know, the idea of not being allowed to get into Harvard, but there's a test you have to take that gets you in, and then unless there's legal action, there's really no reason why you don't get entry into the university. So what are the reasons, I mean, what are the reasons why you are not allowed in to this membership? I mean, what are some of them? We hear that you're not allowed, and until you're allowed, you can't join, you know, the European Union. But what's stopping you? What's disallowing you?
I'm sorry, I think Professor Kalicak, that's again for you. Thank you for the question. If you can,
yeah, I didn't hear.
Quickly.
Could you, Marcus, just tell me, because I could hear well.
Oh, okay. So the question was, from what I understood, sort of what is the reason that you know, EU application is sort of being drawn out for Ukraine?
We still don't know, in fact, because we're waiting the opinion from the European Commission, and this should be crucial, in fact, crucial document, and it should be based. But again, this is, I don't see any reason why Ukraine cannot be granted status of candidate country. I think all scholars, all who are interested in EU studies, who knows all previous rounds of enlargement, starting from the very beginning, starting from the UK until the last one, including Croatia, know all aspects. If you compare the situation of Ukraine now, even the country that is fighting against Russia, Ukraine all have all precondition prerequisites to become a candidate country. Yes, I don't see, and even in the EU, they recognize there are not any kind of legal or some kind of rational argument to say this is again about political. They usually cite the war, Russian with Russia, etc. Or the capacity that the EU does not have capacity to welcome Ukraine at this stage. Yes, there are different arguments, but it's not about Ukraine itself or about the preparedness, readiness of Ukraine to become. Again, I would like to point out we're talking about just candidate country, candidate state, not member.
And then, you know, if you think about that, enlargement decisions in the EU have to be, as of now, unanimous. So every country, member state has to agree to it. I could certainly see countries such as Hungary, right? Orban's Hungary object to that because he has this sort of ambivalent relationship with Putin. But anyway, we have limited time, so about 5 more minutes. So Slavin and Malgorzata, thanks. Please, if you could quickly ask your question, so and then so we can answer your questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Slavin. I'm from Montenegro, currently as a Fulbright PhD student here at FIU. Yeah, I can also confirm what Professor Thiel said about Western Balkan countries being dissatisfied, but not by Ukraine or Moldova or someone getting fast track, but rather by very fuzzy conditions that currently are in the EU, like who can be granted what kind of status. It's really not clear what's happening and what are the criteria. But I wanted to ask Natalia, since she's working on this Occupy Donbass topic, like what were the non-military means of Russia's attempt to occupy Donbass? I've been reading reports that they were basically granting citizenships so that later they can say we come to protect Russian citizens. I'm sure they were sending a lot of money. I'm sure they were spreading information via their own media. So can you tell us a little bit more about these non-military attempts to occupy these parts of Ukraine, how these work? And yeah, I'd be very interested to hear about that. Thank you.
Sure.
But thank you all for great talk. It was very informative.
Sure, and I'll try to be brief about this, but there's essentially a whole range of what is called active measures that Russia has been using in the Donbass. You mentioned some of them, right? Using media as a tool. This is the first thing that Russians have done when they have taken over those areas in the Donbass. They have shut down Ukrainian media and turned on Russian TV. And this is exactly what they're doing in the south of Ukraine right now, areas that were occupied. And basically like using those tools of propaganda to sway public opinion, change it. And in terms of socioeconomic tools, yeah, so since 2014, basically we don't know much about how the two so-called republics are organized and how they fund themselves, but we know for sure that they're not self-sustainable. They completely depend on that patron support, the support of Russia, for basically paying salaries, paying pensions and things like that, right? So, which is why, again, this notion of, independence for these republics doesn't make much sense. And then the citizenship, yes. So a few years ago, through his presidential decree, Putin announced a simplified procedure for the residents of Donbass to obtain Russian citizenship. And basically, I think it was a tool of kind of enhancing legitimacy of Russia and once again swaying people to the side of Russia. But at the same time, it was citizenship not on par with the true Russian citizenship that involves some benefits like Russian pensions and social benefits of sorts. So a person who would obtain this Russian passport but would reside in the Donbass would have to basically move away from the Donbass and into the territory of Russia to obtain citizenship, to obtain benefits from the Russian state. So it was not true Russian citizenship. And the Russian passport would only allow these residents of the Donbass to travel to Russia itself, and I think maybe to like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That's it. So not a lot of perks, but there's that, element of promoting allegiance to Russia. Now I have the passport, I'm a Russian citizen, and of course, it's the justification for Russia to intervene and protect its citizens in Ukraine.
Yeah, just would like to add, this is Russian passport is not attractive for Ukrainians at all, because with Ukrainians, yes, even there are many detained traitors from Crimea. They wanted to get Ukrainian passport to get in EU, etc. So it's not attractive like it could be like 20 years ago. It does. Natalia is right, absolutely right. It does not bring any benefits, and so.
Thank you. And I can just, thinking of the planned referenda, right, that Putin plans, I think he also then tries probably to create these sort of artificial realities on the ground to state like, yeah, we kind of are protecting, sort of similar to what Hitler's arguments were, right, in the late 1930s. Yeah, Margarsata, thank you for holding on, and please.
Yes, so I would like to thank everyone for participation, and especially Sviatozar, who is in Lviv and during the alarm, right? I have a quick question about the saying Dr. Kalibchak said that there is no fast track when it comes to Ukraine participation, application for the membership. But I don't know, Polish society is very hopeful when it comes to helping Ukraine. And as Polish American, I'm thinking about how Ukraine right now is very actively transforming the world, and people have this saying, you cannot fight the system, but actually Ukraine is doing that they are transforming the policies that are old and are not functioning well, or they are not working at all. And we can see it, for example, on Polish-Ukrainian border, when the procedures were very quickly simplified to help Ukrainian refugees, bringing kids, bringing bunch of cats and dogs and other pets. So I'm actually personally very, very hopeful, and I hope that we actually can have fast track for Ukraine, because Ukrainians are proving with blood that they rightfully deserve their place in the democratic family. And this is also my hope, and this is how I would like to end this meeting, with hope for everybody, that we don't know what will going to happen in September. Polish society actually has this saying that we should actually switch Hungary with Ukraine, because it would bring more advantages for European Union to have a pro-democratic country as a member, not a pro-Russian country as a member, right? So maybe there is fast track for Ukraine. Let's be hopeful, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I couldn't have said it better, right? And to end on sort of a positive note. And I think we're already over time. Just a few more things. First of all, of course, part of me, I think probably you too, think there's so much more to discuss. I'd love to pick it up at some other time, but at the same time, part of me hopes we don't in the future have to have, many more of these discussions, right? Debating sort of, the issues that come with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I really appreciate it. With that being said, I would ask, I want to thank, of course, first of all, our speakers, but I would also want to show you here a few slides. The FIU Ukraine Response Task Force put up these Ukraine student support. So in case you feel so inclined, please go to go.fiu.edu/Ukraine student support to support our resident students, some of them who are here. And then following that, we also have the tribute to Ukraine. So if you're interested, Professor Philip Church, who just spoke earlier, is co-organizing with a couple of organizations, including FIU, the tribute to Ukraine with poets, with artists, visual artists, on Wednesday, June 29th at 7 p.m. at the Westchester Cultural Arts Center if you're here. And that's donation-based as well. So if you want to just scan your phone, and then you can RSVP, but you can also go to the website What If Works and RSVP there. Now, there's nothing left for me to say, but except for thanking our speakers. We'll be in touch anyway. I also want to thank you all for attending and for keeping, the awareness about sort of the drastic nature, right, of what is happening going on here in the US, but also in Europe, elsewhere, where people, start to, I guess, maybe have some sort of war fatigue or get sidetracked by other mass shootings or what have you not, right? So please do be yourself also an important part of keeping, the Ukrainian flame alive. And in that sense, I stay in touch. Our European Union Center also has a couple of other forthcoming events. So if you're interested, go to miamieuc.fiu.edu and you can sign up for our newsletter. So if there's nothing else, thank you very much again, Dr. Kalychak. Thank you very much, Dr. Kazianenko. Thanks everyone for attending. And hopefully I'll see one or the other. And in the future, in a better future for Ukraine, right? And for the world.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.